right. Well, welcome to the afternoon session, the discussion panel, how to create healthy shorelines while facing challenges. We've got Lynn Markham here from UW Land Use Center, and from the last session, and also Kay is still here. Kay, is it Lutze or
Lutze.
Lutze. All right. I didn't know if it's going to pronounce the Z that hard or not. I apologize.
That's okay.
And then we're also joined by Tom Onofrey from Marquette County, as zoning administrator. And we're also welcoming Crystal vonHoldt from Wisconsin DNR and Aaron Pruitt from Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Research Scientist. So we'll jump right into here. Are you guys just kind of doing questions through the chat? And
Sure, that'd be great, Derek. Yeah, and I'll get us started a little bit here and then hand it off to Aaron. So in Wisconsin, we have a range of tools we can use when facing shoreland challenges, such as high water levels. Some of the tools include shoreland zoning, the Healthy Lakes and Rivers program, shore armoring, as well as flood insurance. Flood insurance, anyone can purchase flood insurance. You don't have to live in the floodplain. This panel will describe how these tools can work together to address shoreland challenges, as well as current conflicts between these tools. So here you can see the panelists and who we work for, what we do. Aaron Pruitt is going to start us off with an introduction to the groundwater flooding happening across Wisconsin inland lakes, especially seepage lakes. Then each of our other panelists will spend just a few minutes introducing themselves, and we'll follow that by Q&A. We also brought a number of photo slides to illustrate examples of creating healthy shorelands while facing challenges that may help us with the Q&A. So with that, Aaron, if you just want to tell me when you want me to advance slides, I'll do that.
Sure, thanks, Lynn. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Pruitt. I'm a water resources scientist in the water use section at the DNR. The water use section deals with groundwater quantity issues across the state, working on things like high capacity wells, Great Lakes diversions, and one of the issues that we've been dealing with a lot recently is groundwater flooding across the state. And it's just wanted to give a brief background on what groundwater flooding is and sort of the challenges it's creating for lakes, particularly seepage lakes across the state. So next slide, please. So again, I'll just give a brief background on what is groundwater flooding, discuss briefly what's being measured, what's that telling us, and I'll talk about where this groundwater flooding happens. So next slide. When people think about the word flooding, they have a very clear idea in their mind of what's happening. They think about a big river filling up and going over its banks, and then it spreads out over the land. And if you're old enough, you can think back to the Mississippi in 1965, 93 floods, even more recently in Ontario, Wisconsin, in 2018. But groundwater flooding is a little bit different. It's a different animal. It has different causes, and therefore it has to be treated a little bit differently. Next slide. Groundwater flooding is the slow rise of the water table over the course of many months or years. It's usually due to a lot of precipitation over an extended period of time, and that water level just keeps going up and up and up. And at a certain point, you start having the groundwater, at or above your basement or your septic system. And in the case of, fields and seepage lakes, you have water levels coming up above the surface or raising the water levels in those seepage lakes. So this is just a great picture from Huron Lake in Waushara County with a no parking sign several feet past the shore. Next slide, please. So, these differences between groundwater flooding and the sort of, more typical event-based flooding. Groundwater flooding is something that just slowly happens over time, and it's caused by an extended period of wet weather. And because it takes, months to years for that mounding of the water table to occur, that means it takes months or years for that mounding to recede back to a more normal or typical level. This is different than what most people think about when they're thinking about flooding, where you have one big storm or a couple of big storms in a short period just dump a lot of rain, and there's too much water to soak into the ground. There's too much water for the stream to carry away. That sort of happens in a matter of hours or days, but then it can take a little bit longer, days to weeks, for that flooding to recede. Next slide. So groundwater flooding is, what's been happening now. Spring Green area back in 2008 was getting a lot of this flooding. And this sort of more typical event-based flooding, these big storm events, or something like the big rainstorms we had roll through Dane County in 2018, where we were getting 14 inches or more rain in one day. And again, things like the 93 flooding and the 2008 flooding. Next slide. And I'll point out that these are not mutually exclusive things. Groundwater flooding is when everything is wet. The soil is wet, the groundwater level is high. That primes the pump for a smaller storm can cause event-based flooding. And if you have several event-based floods, you have big storms, that makes things wet and gets the water levels to come up. So they're not, mutually exclusive. They do exacerbate one another. Next slide. One analogy that we like to use when thinking about groundwater flooding is to treat it like a bank. Think of it like a bank. You have deposits coming in like precipitation, groundwater or surface water flow. You have the withdrawals like evapotranspiration, runoff, you have pumping, you have some groundwater and surface water outflows. And then you can check the balance in your bank account, how much groundwater we have, by looking at things like base flow, lake levels, and groundwater levels. We have a lot of that monitoring across the state. Next slide. So again, feel free to ask questions as they come up. Someone asked, Spring Green 2008 shows high water and irrigation in the background. Yes, correct. That was what was happening. One field was flooding, but they needed water on the crops a field away, so they were still irrigating. So one thing we can do in this bank analogy is, sort of track these deposits of water coming in. And one thing we like to do with that, one way to think about that, tracking those deposits, is what's called this cumulative precipitation anomaly. I won't go into all the math behind it, but it's essentially looking at on a monthly time step, are you having more or less rain than average? If you have more, it's a positive number. If it's less, it's a negative number. And then you just keep a running tally of all those monthly differences. And so when you do that, you can sort of put these time series into a probability of occurrence. So most of the time, 75% of the time, you're getting precipitation within that dark gray bar. And then 90% of the time, you're getting precipitation within the light gray bars. And we found that this tracks really well with shallow groundwater levels. So here we're looking at precipitation and groundwater levels in Waushara County. And you'll notice over the past several years, about 5 years or so, we're off the charts in terms of probability. That's going up because we've been getting a lot of precipitation over the past several years. Next slide. And we're seeing, too far, there we go. And we're seeing that same trend pretty much everywhere across the state. we're getting a lot of rain in Dane County, in Walworth, up in Burnett, up in Forest. It's just sort of been very wet. And so we're seeing flooding pretty much where we're seeing a lot of rain. So next slide, we're getting reports, we're getting complaints about flooding and property damage, up in Superior, in Waupun, Adams, in Dane County, in the Driftless. It's pretty much everywhere. And it's being driven because we have too many deposits. Those, a lot of precipitation. Next slide. And the only really good way to get out of this problem of very high water levels pretty much everywhere across the state is for us to get smaller deposits and larger withdrawals, or some combination of both. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of control over the deposits. I've been accused of having too much authority as being too many regulations as part of the DNR, but I don't actually have much authority over how much it rains. So we're just sort of waiting for the weather to cooperate. Larger withdrawals, the problem is there's not anywhere to put the water. If we start moving water around, trying to lower lake levels, trying to lower groundwater levels, we don't have anywhere to put the water. The Mississippi is at or near record highs. Lake Michigan is at or near record highs. Most of the streams and rivers in Wisconsin are close to record highs. There's just nowhere to put the water. So we're really treat the root cause of the problem is just to wait for several years of average or maybe even below average precipitation, and that will most likely come again. I mean, it was 10 years ago, we were talking about why are lakes going dry, why are streams going dry. 10 years later, we're talking about flooding, and it's been one of the big challenges for seepage lakes especially. So with that, I'll pass it back off to Lynn, and I believe Crystal was going to speak.
If you want to talk a little bit, Crystal, about what you do, and if you want to talk about these photos, go ahead.
Sure. I am Crystal vonHoldt. I am a water management specialist with the Department of Natural Resources based out of the Green Bay office. So my experiences are primarily in and around the Bay, as well as some inland lakes and rivers and streams. I've been in this role for, 13 years. I think now, and I've seen a lot. It always amazes me, both good and heartburn. Trying to help people with protecting their investments and finding long-term successful solutions for the challenges that water can create on our shorelines. These pictures are some relatively recent, awesome examples of a coastal shoreline. The photos were taken, I think it was in 2019 or early, no, it was in 19 after on the bay. This is the lower bay of Green Bay with high water levels. This particular landowner has really emphasized native vegetation within their riprap. They do have an armored shoreline. It's a little bit hard to tell because of the very well established shoreline vegetation that they have. The native shoreline vegetation is definitely a conversation I have as often as possible with waterfront landowners, because rock, it does armor a shoreline, but rock alone isn't an end-all solution. Incorporating those deep-rooted native species not only helps further hold the bank material and stabilize your shoreline, it really offers an amazing visual and green element to the property. I hear from a lot of people that it can, because of its being appreciated and valued, that it can add to your property value, and I guess marketability would be another way to put it. it gives privacy when you have it landscaped. You can definitely keep your native vegetation in a landscaped design where you still have natives. They can be tall growing natives to provide that green privacy, and then they can be shorter natives to give you that viewing corridor of the gorgeous water body that you're on. So I took some photos when I ran across this property, because it doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often where I see something that is a really awesome example of what we encourage to see for projects. So these are looking both ways along the shoreline on a coastal shoreline with high water, and their riprap was intact and their vegetation was fantastic.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think I'll hand it off to Tom now to introduce himself, since I think most people that are here heard Kay and I in the last session. And Tom, I stuck in just a couple, not that. Sorry. Okay. How about if we give you a rain garden slide to talk about? You could talk about healthy shorelands.
Sure. I'm Tom Onofrey. I'm the zoning administrator for Marquette County. I've been here 24 years. Spent all that time enforcing shoreland zoning standards, and back in 2014 became part of the Healthy Lakes grant program. That was a new program we were establishing. And a couple of the practices, there's 5 practices in the grant program, I guess, jump out as far as handling water and runoff. One would be rain gardens. So you catch that water as it's coming off your impervious surfaces and get it to soak in before it can go other places on your property. And I think Lynn does have another slide of an infiltration practice. We have trenches and pits. So what you're doing is excavating in this case, a trench a few feet deep, lining it with filter fabric, put clean stone, filter fabric on top of it, and then diverting water to soak in these infiltration trenches to keep it from going down the slope. Now, with Crystal's slide, we do have other practices in Healthy Lakes that I think all 5 practices can be used to control runoff. That armored shoreline she showed with the plantings, we do have a native planting practice that you can get a grant for up to 350 square feet. We have diversion practices so that you can divert water from running down a slope, in this case, diverting it to an infiltration practice. And even the fish sticks, which is our 5th practice, I think can be used to protect your shoreline from erosion by controlling wave action when you do get high water. The 2 beers there to test.
That's good, Tom.
Exactly.
Right. Kay, do you want to introduce yourself briefly, or do you want to just go straight to questions?
Yeah, I'll just remind everybody who I am. So I am the Shoreland Policy Coordinator, and also in 2018 moved into a supervisory role for the Northeast region for the Waterways and Wetlands program. And just want to mention that Crystal and I we sit on a high water, actually a high groundwater team in the Northeast region to field some of the proposals that people have to deal with the water that they're experiencing on their seepage lake. So we see a variety of things, and Crystal does our water regulating in terms of the permitting when anything is in need of that. And she's a wonderful resource to go to for some really good, healthy shoreline practices, especially when it comes to designing successful riprap projects. So just wanted to mention that. So we can go into questions, Lynn, if you want.
Sure, I think that makes sense. So the first question that I see here that we haven't talked about is, what are the ramifications of pumping as a withdrawal strategy? And then I think I'll add to that one a response that came. Crystal Lake in Forest County has been pumping all winter, into neighboring Pickerel Lake, and the levels are going down slowly.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Crystal, go ahead.
Well, I can talk about the regulatory aspect. Aaron, do you
Sure.
want to start with maybe the water levels and groundwater flooding?
Yeah, I'll just point out that pumping as a strategy to deal with these high water levels is something that's been tried in a lot of places, and it's been somewhat successful in a couple of locations. The things you have to remember are you're not just lowering the level in the lake. As soon as you lower the level in the lake, that just means there's more room for groundwater to flow in. And so you're having to move a lot of water, and then you have to deal with how many pumps do you need, how big of a pump, all the withdrawal and discharge permits you have to get, and ultimately where do you put the water. You can't lower your lake by making the flooding on the next lake down. If the next lake over isn't as bad, then maybe you're not really causing a problem there. So it is sort of a site-specific situation. So it does sound like Crystal Lake and Forest has been doing pretty well, but there are other places where they've tried it and they're just running pumps continuously with not much effect.
And to add what Aaron described, the permitting can be pretty intense. Multiple programs at the agency are often involved. A lot of different resource impacts are evaluated, and it can definitely become a domino effect project. By lowering water in one lake, the water has to go somewhere. So like what Aaron said, putting your problem onto someone else, causing them flooding, changing their water body conditions. We look at that, aquatic invasive species. We look at, is the lake, what is that high water level? Is it part of a natural seepage level high? Is it above that high? What would it take if it's pumping or earth disturbance to try to lower that water level? It can trigger a lot of different permits. So it is very site specific, and what might work for one lake might not work for other lakes.
A related question here on water levels is what happens to the lake that was drained? Is there a potential of permanent low water?
And I don't think there's much potential of, a permanent low water. The thing we have to recognize is that lake levels vary naturally. You expect the water levels in a seepage lake to go up and down some. It's not going to stay at one constant level all the time, and it's really a function of those precipitation trends over several years. So if you could pump the lakes right now because they're so high, they would eventually fill back in from just precipitation and groundwater flowing into the lake.
Okay. I see a question here about dam safety. I'm not sure if we have somebody here to answer it, but if deep-rooted dense vegetation is so important to mitigate high water erosion, why does the DNR Dam Safety Unit require the removal of vegetation and the maintenance of mowed grass to the water line on retention berms and dikes?
I can jump in, and I'm not in the dam program. I'm not a water management engineer, but I know just enough to at least give a generic answer. Usually dam systems or dikes, because they're designed and constructed and intended to hold back water, impound water to a certain depth, whether it's a small dam or a large dam. Woody vegetation, because of the deep-rooted systems, can really break apart that berm or that dam. So the stability of the dam, because it isn't, I guess, a bank is different than a dam. As far as just from a dimensional perspective. So trees growing on a dam the root system can easily cause like seepage holes where water can start entering into the dam structure, that dike or that berm, and start eroding it from the inside out pretty much. So it can cause a conduit both ways, up and down, back and forth through that dam. So they do have some pretty significant concerns for the woody vegetation, and which is why they keep it low or gone on a bank. Go ahead, Kay.
And I'll add to this because I am not a water management engineer either, but I do supervise 2 of them. And I did have this question, and the primary reason is for rodents. The rodents will burrow, and that way the owners can observe if they're there or not. So really, when you have a lot of the vegetation and the woody vegetation, if you have rodents burrowing, you will impact the integrity and the stability of the dike. So really, it's to
Twofold.
twofold. So rodents is one of the primary answers.
Okay. And then we've got a question that looks to me like it goes to Tom. Are there problems with ice buildup over infiltration trenches in winter with subsequent overland flow bypassing the trenches in spring?
Not that I'm aware of. We've been using infiltration trenches in Marquette County for a long time prior to Healthy Lakes program. So I have not heard about them. Certainly you're gonna have some ice buildup on them, but as the ground thaws, your infiltration trench would thaw right along with it.
Okay. We've got a comment and question. We recently had a DNR permitted riprap project done on our lake, about 80 feet long. Over the entire distance, the buffer zone was tilled, an irrigation system installed, and is flat and turf grass planted. Doesn't the DNR permit process require some sort of natural revegetation on the land side of the riprap? And where does one find those requirements?
And before Crystal starts with the answer to that, I will also add that a riprap project or exemption doesn't give authorization to remove the buffer. So there still is that shoreland zoning aspect to it, but I will let Crystal add to what the permit process is and revegetation.
Thank you, Kay, for adding the shoreland zoning aspect to it. The riprap permit requirements are for revegetation of the riprap structure above the ordinary high water mark to the top of the riprap structure. So it's entirely limited to that structure, the riprap itself. From the top of the rock to the ordinary high water mark is what is required to be vegetated. We do encourage that they consider native vegetation or replanting, using natives for that almost landscaped mindset to get their good shoreline buffer and get that vegetation in there to further enhance the protection that the riprap provides. But the actual requirement is for within the rock gaps itself.
Okay. Related to draining water and whether it freezes this time of year throughout the winter, Jenny wrote, we use heat tape in the drain lines from gutters into our mitigation field under our driveway. So that's one way to keep water running. Yeah. Here's something from Waushara County. Many lakes in Waushara County have been adopting no wake ordinances in response to recent high water levels. And I have encountered neighbors, property owners who don't feel this is necessary and are very opposed to such restrictions. Are there outreach efforts or resources available to help inform people why restrictions such as these are needed to help manage the system during periods of high water levels? I know that there's a book written by Tamara Dudiak about water recreation, including ordinances for no wake ordinances, and maybe you use that in adopting your ordinance. The Extension Lakes group, so Eric and Patrick Goggins specifically, talk about lake recreation. So that's where I would suggest you go in terms of education on that topic. Derek, how does regional groundwater flooding affect runoff or flooding events? In areas such as the Fox River, impoundment water levels tend to rise much quicker during rain events than in the recent past.
Yeah, the regional groundwater flooding is definitely going to exacerbate those surface water runoff flooding events. When the water level is high and everything is saturated, that rain has nowhere to go but to run off. In a drier period, some of that water could have infiltrated more. There was more room in the subsurface for water to percolate downwards. So it's sort of taking smaller storms to create the same amount of runoff that you were seeing during those drier periods. And once things start drying out, we'll start, getting back to, bigger storms needed to create that same amount of runoff.
I will work on repeating the book and author. I'm working on that in the chat right now. I'll provide you with the title and the link. It's at the Extension Lakes bookstore. Jim wrote, we want to establish a water level gauge, perhaps called a staff gauge on our lake. Where is the best place to start this project? Are there permits required? Advice?
Well, I can offer a little bit of information as far as the permits. Occasionally, I come across the projects for data collection, scientific monitoring stations, and it would depend where the structure is proposed, if it's below the ordinary high water mark on lake bed or riverbed, and then really getting a good understanding of what is that structure, what is the footprint, is it massive, is it a pole with some kind of monitoring station or collection container. There are permits required for structures on lake bed and riverbed, but scientific data collection is kind of its own category. So I think we do have a lot more flexibility if it's a single pole kind of structure, which is one of the last types of projects that I was contacted about. This one was tucked back in right up against a shoreline and not causing any kind of navigational hazards or obstruction, and being a single pole, there's not much of an impact. So it is a case by case, which sometimes is the answer I give for a lot of questions. But if you have something in mind, I would suggest reaching out to a water management specialist and letting them know what the details are and where the placement would be, and figure out if that does require a permit.
I'll also mention that we've worked with a lot of lake groups and citizen scientists who have wanted to, establish these water level gauges. And we can get that data entered when you collect it as part of our citizen monitoring network into the SWIMS database, which is the DNR's, basically their water quantity database. And a lot of folks work through either me and water use, Katie Hine, who's also with the DNR, works on lakes, the DNR, or through the local county conservation office can sometimes help establish some of those staff gauges.
Okay, and looks like we had a number of other responses on that in the chat. Another question for Tom. I've had a hard time finding a group to work with for a Healthy Lakes project. Is there a clearinghouse or list of groups looking for participants? And actually, Tom, I'd like to add one more question that I have. Can you tell me about the funding for Healthy Lakes and Rivers projects? Is that ongoing, or what do you know about that?
Okay, well, I'll start with yours. It's part of the surface water grant program. So yes, it is ongoing. We are allocated, I believe it was $250,000 in the most recent round of grants. So it is an ongoing source. As far as getting into a Healthy Lake project, it does require that you have a sponsor. Lake District can be a sponsor, Lake Association, county can be a sponsor. I would suggest if you do want to try to do a Healthy Lakes grant, to contact your Land and Water Conservation Department in your county, because a lot of them are working with Healthy Lakes. I know our county conservation, this is in his third year of doing it. You don't have to be on a lake with other participants. It just would have to be doing it through the county conservationist. He can have multiple lakes in your county with participants all in the same grant. So the total of the grant is $25,000 for any application. So it can be on multiple lakes, but I would start with contacting your county conservationist, or if you have a lake association or a lake district, talking to them.
Okay, Nick Homan writes that he ran into this issue recently about Healthy Lakes and Rivers, and a regional RC&D can also be a sponsor.
Yep.
So those are scattered around the state. Okay, your town can also be a sponsor.
Any government entity can be a sponsor.
Okay. Okay, Derek writes, high water levels are temporary in many lakes across the state. What advice do you give to shoreland owners who want to add riprap or other shoreline protection for a temporary situation, although temporary may be several years?
Well, I can jump in with the conversations I've had with a lot of the landowners around the coastal shoreline and inland seepage lakes. I do encourage that they envision long-term what it is that they would like their shoreline to look like, and consider the investment that it sounds like from hearing from landowners and contractors. Placing riprap is not a cheap endeavor. And the naturalness of a shoreline, the vegetation, the unarmored shorelines that are now proposed to be armored. I do mention that if you don't have structures that are at immediate risk, if you can wait and just see, whether it's week by week or month by month, if we at this point, we've already made it through some pretty significant water levels. I encourage people, if you can, if you're comfortable, it's their decision, but if you can just take it day by day and wait, you may be able to get through this without having that added expense and modification to your shoreline.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
I will.
Yeah, go ahead, Kay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I see one that is zoning related. So if one's foundation is damaged by high water, what permitting is required to repair the damaged foundation? So I would direct you right to your county zoning agency, your local zoning administrator, to determine what permits they need. You might need a floodplain permit, you might need a general zoning permit, and you might need a shoreland permit. So it's different in all of the areas based on what you're in. So contact your local county zoning administrator.
You see there's a link to the SWIMS database. Other questions? Yes. Can a slope leading to a low area be included in a rain garden? Tom?
Yes, I guess the short answer is yes. If you go to the Healthy Lakes website, you'll find a lot of help with designing rain gardens, but certainly that could be part of it. Rain gardens really come down to the type of soil you have is a big factor, and whether you have high groundwater is another big factor on where you would put a rain garden.
What is the requirement or guidance, Tom, on how high can the groundwater be and you can still put in a rain garden? Is it a foot down or more than that?
No, you would definitely, if you have high groundwater, you're gonna have a difficult time putting a rain garden. So, I mean, if you have a mound septic system, it's probably a bad sign for you to have a rain garden. That's the indicator of high groundwater.
Mhm.
And you really do need well-drained soils.
Okay.
So even though this is a question and answer session really for the panel, I guess I would throw out there a question for you all. So maybe you can help others that are on the call. Have any of you had to deal with something potentially drastic to either save your property or your structure or your sanitary system and found some really good resources? So if you have and you want to share some resources or some thoughts for other people who are on the call, I would ask that you would put them in the chat box, even though it doesn't come off as a question. Kevin is asking, could you do a rain garden in clay or other hard packed soil? My answer would be no. Tom, have you had any
No.
successes with that? We
Yeah,
have not.
If you're in clays, it's not going to be a viable option for you.
You need a well-drained soil.
I mean, because the object is for that rain garden to hold the water for a time period and then drain away. And in clay, it's just not going to happen very quickly.
Tom, there's another question. Are low groundwater levels and well-drained soil on the overall property also a requirement for the infiltration trench?
Yes, yeah, you're definitely going to want the similar conditions for a trench as you would for a rain garden. That's where, you could, if you can't do a rain garden or an infiltration trench, you can do diversions and maybe divert water to an area where it would have time to soak in rather than running down a slope and straight to the lake.
Okay, and we have a new question. Can you share any experiences you may have with preventing erosion, protecting property on flashy streams, especially areas with steep banks and sandy soils?
Well, I can jump in for that one. There are a lot of very flashy, eroded or incised streams in at least Northeast Wisconsin that I've been to over the years. And they can be kind of tricky, trying to balance the amount of rock that you put into a system with other more natural means or other creative solutions instead of just lining streams with rock. It helps with erosion, but it can cause other problems as well. And it can cause erosion. What I've seen from communities, I've seen some of them who create stormwater utilities with easements actually following rivers or streams so that a community group can have a little bit more control, have some funding, and help focus on what is making it flashy and finding long-term solutions, trying to take a little bit of that burden off of individual private landowners. Where we don't have community-based stormwater utilities, then like a utility fee, that's I guess what I was referring to. For private landowners, it is trying to find that balance, designing rock and permitting rock on outside bends, on steep eroding banks in combination with bank sloping, incorporating native vegetation, maybe thinning out. If it's a steep wooded hillside with a thick canopy, then thinning that out so that you can get more sunlight down to the ground for ground cover, or changing your ground cover from turf grass to a native with deeper roots. On a very flashy system in Northeast region, we did find like a coconut log on a very flashy part of this river system, and it had been permitted. I think it was 10 years. We found it 10 years after it was installed, and it was relatively intact, and it shocked us. So whenever I think about proposals of just rock, I think about, well, let's maybe not just dismiss those biologs or coconut logs right away, thinking they're not going to hold up. They definitely are a good element to combine. So maybe there's rock at the toe, and then we look at biologs or bank sloping, different techniques put together. I really don't think using one single type of practice is a really good long-term fit. I think combining and kind of spreading out the wealth, that's getting a little bit of the benefit from all different practices, are the way to go.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. Our next question, are there better solutions than riprap for protecting structure foundations? And I think some of it could go to your coconut log, what you were just talking about. Anyone have other things to add? Okay. Paul adds, we had a chronic wet basement issues for years and ultimately fixed the issue by connecting all downspouts to 20 to 30 foot PVC pipes buried just under the grass and leading to 3 rain gardens. A basement contractor quoted $11,000 to fix the water problem. The rain gardens and pipes cost less than $1,000 in a week of my time. And Paul's always got a great selection and large quantities of native plants too for his rain gardens. It's his rain garden you're looking at here. One of his rain gardens.
Awesome.
Any experience or advice with rain garden with overdrain or under drains?
I think that means an overflow pipe is what I'm assuming that would mean.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly that can be designed into the rain garden and is a lot of times in case there is a severe rain event. I think it's a common thing to do.
Okay, and Nick has added that soil encapsulating bags can work well in some situations on streams as well as lake banks. And I think that goes back to what are your options other than riprap. And I don't know if Kay or Crystal, if you want to jump in. Oh, okay. Vegetative bags. And didn't one of you talk about water bags too?
Yeah, so what we've also experienced on some of the seepage lakes and some of the coastal flooding, they've actually used what are called Aqua Dams. So it is a big water-filled, almost balloon tube-like structure that protects the structure on the property from flooding or water damage, and they have been used very successfully. There's some videos online. I can try and find one, but if you YouTube, Google search it, Aqua Dam, the company actually is online, and they have some really good videos showing them. So that's one recommendation. The EnviroLock bags, we've had some very successful projects with the county property owners using EnviroLock bags. So that's another thing to look into. I guess one thing to think about is how close is your structure and what's the likelihood of continuing high water and potentially ice shoves going to be for damaging it, and looking at whether or not you want to keep it there in the long term. Crystal, you have anything else?
No, I think that covers it. I was thinking soil lifts, which are similar to the contained bags. It's just more of like soil burritos that you construct at the bank or at the shoreline. But again, it's the same kind of thing. It's using some kind of fabric that is plantable, or you can vegetate it, and it just gives the soil a little added integrity.
Shelley has a question. Can basement sump water be directed to rain gardens as well as that from roof drains?
Well, when you design a rain garden, you need to calculate how much water you're going to be putting in this, or at least a good estimate of it. It's, with roof drains, you can do that. Just based on a 1-inch rain event or 2-inch rain event. With a sump pump, I think it'd be a little harder. I mean, you could attempt to do it, but depending on your sump pump situation, I know I have people here around Montello that their sump pump runs all the time. So, that's not going to work for a rain garden. So it really would depend on how much water your sump pump is pumping on a regular basis. But yeah, definitely roof drains. That's one of the main uses for a rain garden for a lot of folks.
Derek writes, if pumping is being considered as a potential option for a lake, what is the process used to determine where the water will outlet, especially in seepage lakes with no natural outlet? How far downstream from the outlet is the impact considered?
Kay, do you want to take that one, or should I?
Well, I guess the answer is it depends. This is a really challenging one, and there's a variety of things that come into play when determining whether or not pumping can occur, where it's going to occur, and how it can happen. Where is the outlet? Is the outlet below the ordinary high? Is it above the ordinary high? You'll need a wastewater pumping permit. We'll need to figure out if there's any AIS, invasive species, that could impact the pumping, and whether or not the pumping, whether or not the water is going to potentially enter another water body. So, there's so much, Derek, that goes into a pumping proposal that it's really hard to answer how far downstream from the outlet the impact is considered. And Crystal, you've worked on quite a few of these as well. Can you shed any more definitive light? That I was very general in my answer.
Oh, that was a good overview, because that's exactly every one of the pumping requests that we have received are just very multifaceted and overwhelming for everyone. Trying to figure out the scope, how wide of an impact that project would have. We need to do our due diligence for the public interest. There's one scenario where one lake community is designing a project to take their water and move it to the lake next door. And of course, that lake community is saying, absolutely not, we don't want your water. So there are things that we have the authority to get involved with and review and authorize or modify. And there are things that we don't have that legal right to make those decisions. So sometimes it comes down to civil discussions and agreements as well, because it does affect, it's domino effect. If you're going to put your problem on someone else, they may say, we don't want your problem. So how do you resolve that? On top of what could be many different types of permits required. And just because a permit is required doesn't always mean that the project design meets the criteria for a permit to be issued.
And I would jump in here. We do have a lake in Marquette County that is pumping. And one of the things that came up was the impact on other property owners to where this water is going. They're pumping it to an area that is a wetland, but you know, that's private property. And while the initial release of water is onto a agreeable property owner's property, neighbors are impacted by it also.
Mhm. Also on this topic, Linda wrote Shell Lake, which had pumping, had to negotiate with Native Americans regarding wild rice seeding, trout fishermen, if diverting to a stream, etc. If you're not familiar with wild rice, it's very affected by water levels. So if you add water or reduce water, it's going to be affected. What I think is probably an easier question, how much soil prep is required to successfully use vegetative bags? Is there any necessity to add better soil to a sandy base if you're using those vegetative bags?
Gosh, I think that the vegetated bags like Envirolock they're coming from a company that creates them. They're creating this product, they're prepping them, and they're providing them either already bagged or they're giving their customer the soil and the bags and you bag them yourself. I don't really know what happens on the customer's end, but I would imagine that there is engineering and a lot of thought put into what kind of soil, what's going to be most successful, seed and soil ratio. I think some you can get pre-seeded so that they will sprout and grow on their own, or you can cut them and plant them. I think that there's probably many different types of products. Kay, do you know anything
Yeah.
more about the soil bags?
Yeah, and I would go to the Envirolock website because it has some really, really good information in terms of site prep and what's required. I will tell you that Envirolock bags were used really successfully with a shoreland cutting violation with one of the counties, and it was an incredible steep slope with more sandy soils. And the Envirolock bags did wonderful. It's stable after the last couple of years and it revegetated really quickly. So they can be used quite successfully, but in terms of actual technical, I would take a look on, the manufacturer's website.
Okay, and here we've got a comment from Nick too, who I imagine has experience with these since he does shoreland landscaping. Yes, the bags need a mix of about 60% mineral and 40% organic content for soil. Manufacturer does make recommendations on overall soil content within the bag. And I was just thinking, based on what you were saying, Kay, too, if you're talking really sandy slopes, it makes me think really dry slopes. And so having this organic content helps it hold moisture so those plants can grow and get established. Other questions? All right. I'm going to go back to the beginning just so you can see our names and who we're with again in case you want to get a hold of us. Here we go. So I'll leave that up. Oh, Nick added too much organic content can cause slumping over time. So the bag mix is important. Okay. All right. Derek, what is the permitting requirements on placing Envirolock bags below the ordinary high?
I can get that one. uh, so Envirolock bags are similar type products for shoreline or riverbank stabilization are considered a structure. It's a stabilization structure, which means it's a regulated activity under Chapter 30, the set of statutes focused on navigable water bodies. We have a lot of different options. There are exemptions, which means even though it's a regulated activity, you do not have to get a permit in your hand if you meet certain criteria. We also have general permits. When a project doesn't meet an exemption for whatever reason, then general permits are the next tier up. It's a shorter review time, a lower application fee, and it does a general permit, depending on your activity, has a black and white list of requirements that you can check off. When you go through and you can say, yep, my project meets all of these, then you are eligible for that general permit and you can apply for it and receive your permit. If you're not eligible for the exemption and you're not eligible for a general permit, then the last tier is an individual permit. It's a longer review. It has a higher application fee. It's a permit that when you get the permit and the conditions, they are individualized or tailored to your project and your site conditions. So Envirolock bags are similar products, soil lifts, similar to riprap or seawalls, are all considered a structure. We definitely have exemptions and general permits for what we call bioengineering or the biological shoreline structures. And depending on the location and designation of the water body and design, if it meets the exemption, then I recommend that people keep the checklist of the exemption requirements in your project folder at home. Make sure you have that in case anybody asks or contests that you needed a permit and didn't get one. If it's not exempt, then you start a permit process. Hopefully a general permit would cover it. I didn't want to get too technical, but hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, and then I see Jen's asking where you can find the exemptions. They are, sorry, Lynn, I don't mean to take your job away.
You got the answers.
They are online. The DNR website does have a Waterway specific website. If you just go to the main page, DNR homepage, in the search box, if you type Waterway permits, oh, did somebody get it? Thank you, Kay. It'll lead you to the Waterway specific page, and we have separated by regulated activities. So depending on riverbank or lakeshore erosion control, you can click your way into that appropriate type of water body. There's some question and answer, a decision matrix to help you find your permit type. So you answer a couple questions and it can lead you, it's not 100% accurate, but it certainly helps get people pointed in the right direction most of the time. But it'll lead you to links where you can learn more about exemptions, general permits, and the individual permit process.
Jim
Thank you, Kay.
says thanks. All right, do we have further questions? We don't have to go to 3 o'clock if you guys are out of questions. They just wanted to give us plenty of time to answer whatever questions you had. Okay. Well, oh, here we go. I heard about vegetative blankets with a plant mix as desired. Any comments on their use? Anybody have experience with those?
We are actually starting to see those in the Healthy Lakes program for the native plantings. I have seen them on site and they are a nice product. I never priced one out. I don't know exactly how costly they are, but they give you quick reward for the work, you know, getting your planting going.
Do you have any information, Tom, on where those are coming from? Are your local nurseries carrying them, or are they shipping them in?
They are shipping them in. There's a place, I'd have to look back, and I guess maybe this is a site. I'd have to look
Yeah.
it up there. I believe there's a place down by Janesville that makes them, manufactures them.
Okay. Great. Okay, and Nick comments on these. They work great. They do require another level of planning to grow them out first. Agricola sells them. They also make Envirolock.
Yep, that's the name, right?
Okay. They were at the lightning round yesterday and they're one of the sponsors. Great. Agricol. Okay.
Thanks, Nick.
Is that Agricola? Okay. By pre-vegetated, do you mean pre-grown with live plants?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well,
So like sod, but
yeah, they feed them and start them, so when you get them, they're already growing.
okay. Do they have like a fiber woven into them, or is it just soil and plant roots?
No, it's in a fiber mat.
Okay.
Yeah, you just roll it out like erosion control blanket.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would ask if anybody is going to use one in this next season at all, send some pictures in. We'd love to see, we'd love to see the before and the during and the after.
Mm-hmm. It could be done, do it yourself using ECB. Not sure what
Erosion
ECB.
control blanket.
Okay. And a bit of a frame. Mm-hmm.
Yep, Jim, you're right on that.
Yeah.
So I have a curiosity question, and you can put your answer in the chat if it's been yes, but has there been any issues getting insurance on any lakes that might be high with seepage, or seepage lakes that are high, or any coastal? I'm kind of curious as to whether or not insurers are asking any new questions out there with regard to living on the coast, right? Living on the water. Doesn't seem to be. Thanks.
All right.
Right, is there any more questions out there? I know everyone's gonna think of them as soon as we shut the chat off. But if you do have any questions from any of our presenters, if you go into the agenda, if you click on their name, you can message them directly. So if you have a question that's very site specific that you want to talk one-on-one with them, or just something you think of while you lay down tonight and you're dreaming about rain gardens and infiltration trenches, you can get up in the morning, message these guys and get your answers. Of course, I know Paul dreams about rain gardens. So other than that, if we don't have any more questions, I thank everybody for spending the afternoon with us and for our presenters. And hopefully some of you will consider joining your regional events tomorrow. There's several throughout the state virtually, so check those out. Otherwise, I think that's all we have for right now.
Thanks, everybody, and
Thank you.
thanks to the other panel members.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.